The river carried the last light of day upon its restless skin, a ribbon of copper and gold winding through the desolate valley. Heat still clung to the dust, but evening's breath was softer, weaving between the cottonwoods and stirring the faint smell of wild sage. At the edge of the water sat a young woman, her dress once white, but dulled now to the color of bone. She held her daughter against her, as if the child were the last flame in a world gone cold. Her face bore the softness of youth still, though shadows of weariness had begun to carve their lines. 24 years old and yet older than the seasons, her spirit had carried more weight than most men ever would. She had been told she was cursed, told she brought ruin to those who lingered near her. When her husband disappeared, taken by fever or fate, the village whispered louder, until whispers became commands and commands became exile. Homelessness had not been her choice, but it had become her inheritance. The child shifted in her lap, small and warm, a bundle of dark hair and restless eyes. 6 years old, she still found delight where none should be found. She dipped her hand into the river and watched the water bead like crystal on her fingers, pretending they were jewels, treasures from another world. She asked if they might have fish for supper. The woman did not answer. Silence was kinder than truth, and the truth was hunger. The doll lay in the child's lap, stitched from rags, its seams loose, its shape barely holding. It had survived the road with them, soaked by storms, torn by briars, mended by a mother's tired hands. The girl clutched it as if it were a companion, whispering secrets into its silent cloth ear. Her innocence was the only defense against despair, and her laughter, rare though it was, struck her mother's heart like sunlight through cloud. The woman gazed at the river and felt the temptation of surrender. Its song was steady, low, and strangely comforting, as if it promised rest. She wondered if she could simply close her eyes, let the water swallow her, drift into quietness. Yet the child stirred, leaned against her with sleepy weight, and the thought fled like a coward. The warmth of that little body chained her to life. Despair might beckon, but love forbade it. A rustle stirred across the water. The woman's breath caught, and her arms tightened around her daughter. Through the haze of dusk, she saw movement on the far bank, a horseman, tall and still, half shrouded by shadow. The animal beneath him shifted, stamping against the ground, its muscles gleaming faintly in the fading light. The rider did not advance immediately, nor call out. He simply watched. His hat brim cast his face in mystery, but the outline of his frame was sure and strong, like a tower against the waning sky. Fear pricked her, but so did curiosity. Few men rode alone at this hour, and fewer still paused to regard an outcast woman and her child. She pulled the girl closer, brushing strands of hair from her cheek, whispering for her to stay quiet. The child obeyed, though her eyes widened at the sight of the horse, the grandness of it, the glint of the bridle catching light like fire. The rider shifted at last, dismounting with a slow grace. He stood for a moment with his hand upon the saddle, as though deciding whether to cross. Then he led the horse toward the shallow stretch of river. Water splashed about its hooves, carrying ripples toward the woman and child. She held her breath, every instinct calling her to run, though her body had nowhere left to flee. He came nearer, and the dying light revealed him piece by piece. Broad shoulders cloaked in a long coat of worn leather, boots caked with the dust of miles, a face weathered by sun and solitude, yet marked with neither cruelty nor scorn. He carried himself not with swagger, but with stillness, like a man long accustomed to silence. The girl's lips parted in wonder, and a sound of delight slipped free before her mother could hush her. The rider's head turned at the small voice, and though his features were shadowed, something softened in the set of his posture. He removed his hat, not as courtesy to equals, but as reverence to the fragile. He stopped a few paces away, careful not to intrude upon their fragile circle. No word left his lips, only the quiet gesture of a hand extended, not to touch, but to offer calm. From a satchel at his side, he drew a piece of bread, wrapped in cloth, and set it gently upon a stone halfway between them. Then he straightened, stepped back, and let the choice rest with her. The woman's chest tightened with conflict. Pride warned her not to accept charity, not again. But hunger was a harsher master, and the child's eyes, wide and shining, were more persuasive than any voice. She rose slowly, her body trembling, and approached the stone. Each step felt like surrender and salvation at once. Her fingers closed around the bread, rough and firm in her palm. She broke a piece, small as she dared, and placed it in her daughter's eager hand. The child bit into it, chewing slowly, savoring every crumb as though it were a feast. The woman tasted her portion after, and though it was plain, it carried the warmth of life back into her veins. The rider said nothing. He simply watched, eyes steady, as though he knew words might shatter what silence preserved. His horse shook its mane, the sound of leather and iron filling the pause between them. For the first time in many nights, the woman felt something shift inside her, not hope, not yet, but the faint stirring of safety. The river sang on, darker now beneath the stars. The wind lifted the man's coat, carrying with it a scent of horse and dust and something faintly sweet, like tobacco long extinguished. He placed his hat back upon his head, his gaze never leaving her face. There was no pity in it, only recognition, as if he saw not her hunger, not her shame, but her endurance. She felt her daughter's hand press into hers, small and certain. The girl whispered that the man looked kind, her voice filled with trust only a child could summon. The woman could not answer. Her heart beat in strange rhythms, torn between fear and longing, between the urge to retreat and the pull of what stood before her. The cowboy did not move closer, yet his presence filled the night as though he had been destined to arrive. He remained at a respectful distance, his shadow long upon the riverbank, until the stars gathered above them like watchful eyes. And in that moment, with bread still warm in her hand and her child's breath soft against her arm, the woman realized her life had shifted upon its axis. For the first time since exile, she was not entirely alone. And just as that realization touched her like fire, the rider spoke at last, his voice low, deep, and carrying across the water with a weight that promised change. "I reckon you've been waiting a long time." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, and she knew in her bones that nothing would remain the same after this night. The fire cracked softly in the hollow of night, its glow painting the woman's face in gold and shadow. She sat with her daughter close, the bread gone, but its memory lingering on their tongues, a reminder of generosity they had not asked for but could not refuse. The cowboy sat a short distance away, his hat tilted low, his silence stretching like a rope between them. He had made no demand for thanks, no inquiry into who they were or where they came from. He merely stayed, as if his presence alone were his offering. Morning found them with mist rising from the river, and the cowboy still near, tending his horse with quiet care. The girl was the first to speak, tugging at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions about his animal, about the gleam of its saddle, about whether she might touch it. The woman hesitated, pride prickling in her chest, but the child's hunger for wonder outweighed fear. She gave a small nod. The cowboy noticed, and his eyes softened. He lifted the child with ease, placing her hand upon the horse's strong neck. The girl laughed, bright, pure, startling in its suddenness. She whispered to the animal, as though sharing secrets only it could keep. The woman watched, torn between suspicion and gratitude, her heart aching with the sight of her child remembering joy. That day he returned again, bringing not bread but dried meat, and once again he offered without insistence. Each time he left space between them, a wide gap of trust waiting to be bridged. His words were few, spoken in a voice steady as earth. Remarks about the sky, about the river's rise, about the way his horse preferred shade to sun. He never asked her name, and she never gave it. Still, something grew in the silence, as if patience itself was the language they shared. But not all eyes were as gentle. The nearby settlement, a small scatter of cabins and storefronts, noticed. Whispers coiled through its dusty streets like snakes. The shopkeeper, thin and sharp-nosed, muttered of foolishness. The preacher, stern and hollow-eyed, warned of curses. "A man risks ruin by tying himself to what the Almighty cast out," he said, his voice heavy with condemnation. Yet an old widow, stooped and kind, spoke differently. She told the cowboy, in a voice worn soft by years, that kindness was never wasted, not even when the world mocked it. The woman sensed these whispers before she heard them. She saw how faces turned when she entered the town with her daughter clutched close, how doors seemed to close a little quicker, how silence pressed heavier in her wake. Pride stiffened her spine, but loneliness gnawed beneath it. She had always been an outsider. Now, even with kindness within reach, she feared it might only deepen her exile. Still, the cowboy came. Day after day, he returned to the riverbank. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes he sat in silence, staring into the fire. Other times he spoke of simple things, the stubbornness of cattle, the quiet beauty of dawn. His words never cut, never probed. They laid stones, one after another, building a path across the emptiness between them. The girl was the bridge. She would run to greet him, her doll flapping in her hand, her voice carrying questions that spilled faster than answers could follow. Did he have a family? Did he live alone? Had he ever seen wolves at night or watched a comet fall from the sky? He listened with patience, answering each with care, his gaze shifting often to the mother as if to seek her permission in every exchange. The woman's resistance wavered. She caught herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the quiet steadiness of his hands, the way he treated his horse as though it were a companion rather than a beast. She noticed how he removed his hat each time he drew near, how he never stepped too close, how his respect felt as tangible as his strength. For the first time since her exile, she felt the stirrings of safety. Yet fear gnawed at her. She remembered the cruelty of men who had judged her unworthy, who had cast her aside when she was most vulnerable. What if this man, too, turned his back? What if kindness was only another form of pity, a softness that would crumble when tested? She told herself she must not hope, must not lean too heavily on what could vanish like smoke. But hope slipped in despite her guard. One evening, as firelight flickered across their faces, the girl fell asleep against her lap. The cowboy sat across from them, his gaze lowered, his voice low. "No one should carry such weight alone," he said. The words struck her heart like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not still. She had no answer, only silence, but he did not press further. He let the moment rest, as if understanding that healing was not born in haste. In the days that followed, the settlement's whispers grew sharper. Some said he had lost his mind, that he risked everything for a woman doomed. A few warned her outright, telling her to stay away, their voices thick with suspicion and scorn. The woman bore it with dignity, though the wounds cut deep. She had learned long ago how to endure cruelty, but she feared what it might mean for the man who offered her kindness. Would the weight of the world's judgment break him, as it had broken so many before? The answer was unclear, for he never faltered. Each morning he appeared, and each evening he lingered, his presence as steady as the river itself. The child trusted him completely now, clinging to him as though he were a father returned from absence. The mother's heart twisted with both joy and terror, joy for the warmth her daughter found, terror for the loss that might come if this fragile thread snapped. One night, as the wind shifted and coyotes called in the distance, the woman finally asked, her voice trembling though her gaze was steady, "Why do you come?" The firelight caught his face, revealing no mockery, no hesitation. "Because no one deserves to be forgotten," he answered simply. Her breath caught. Forgotten. That was the word she had carried like a stone against her chest, the word that had defined her exile. And here, at last, was someone who spoke against it, someone who saw her not as burden, but as human. She turned her face away, tears burning her eyes, but her heart could no longer deny what it longed for. The child stirred in her sleep, murmuring a dream against her mother's arm. The cowboy's gaze lingered on them both, soft and unwavering. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of possibility, of fear, of fragile beginnings. And just as the woman began to believe that perhaps they might carve a place in this unforgiving world, a sound broke the night, a branch snapping in the darkness beyond the firelight, heavy footsteps closing in. Shadows stirred among the trees, voices low and sharp, carrying the echo of men who did not come as friends. The woman's blood turned cold. Her hand clutched around her daughter, and her gaze flew to the cowboy. He rose slowly, his frame tall against the flames, his eyes hard now, steady as stone. The past she had fled was no longer behind her. It was walking toward her in the dark. The fire hissed as shadows thickened at the edge of the clearing. The woman's pulse throbbed in her ears, her arms tightening around her daughter. Figures emerged from the dark. 3 men with faces hard as stone and eyes sharp with cruelty. Their boots crushed the earth as if it belonged to them, their voices carrying the sting of recognition. She knew them, men from her old village, the ones who had spat judgment and cast her into the wild. Their sneers curled like knives, reminding her of every night she had shivered in exile, every insult carved into her memory. "Well," one drawled, his teeth catching the firelight, "the cursed woman has found herself a protector." Another laughed, low and mean. "Not much of one, by the look of him. Doesn't know she'll drag him down like she did the rest." Their words struck like lashes, but the cowboy did not flinch. He stood, broad-shouldered and silent, his hat brim shadowing his gaze. The woman's breath came shallow, shame rising like bile. She wanted to cry out, to shield her child from their venom, but her voice locked inside her chest. Her daughter stirred, frightened, and whispered his name, not the man's name, for she did not know it, but a name she had given him, Protector. The small word rang through the night, fragile yet defiant. The cowboy stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He did not draw his gun, though one rested at his hip. His hands hung loose, his frame steady, every inch of him carved from quiet resolve. "You'll leave them be," he said, his voice low, unshaken. It was not a threat, nor a plea. It was a truth spoken into the air, heavy as iron. The men exchanged glances, scoffing. One spat into the dirt. "You don't know what she is. She'll poison your life same as she poisoned ours." They shifted closer, emboldened by each other's cruelty, but something in the cowboy's stance held them at bay. He did not shout, did not bluster. His stillness was a wall, stronger than weapons, and for a moment the men faltered, unease flickering in their eyes. The woman felt her heart wrench. No one had ever stood between her and the world's contempt. She had borne her shame alone, swallowed the poison of every word, every rejection. Yet here was a man who placed himself in the path of her tormentors without question, without hesitation. Tears pricked her eyes, not of weakness, but of a strange, aching relief. The standoff stretched long, the crackle of fire the only sound. Finally, the first man snarled, frustration cutting through his bravado. "You'll regret this." They retreated into the trees, their threats trailing like smoke. The clearing grew still again, save for the wind carrying the last of their words into the night. The woman's knees trembled, and she sank to the ground, clutching her daughter. The child's eyes shone with fear, but also with something brighter, trust. She clung to the cowboy's leg, whispering, "Don't leave us." His hand came down gently, resting on her hair, a silent promise. When his gaze lifted to the mother, she saw no pity in it, only recognition. He saw her as more than the curse she had been named, more than the burden she believed herself to be. He saw her strength, the endurance that had carried her this far, the love that bound her to her child. In that gaze, she felt herself seen for the first time since her life had shattered. Days passed, and the river carried the memory of that night in its song. The settlement whispered louder now, some mocking, some warning, but the cowboy paid them no mind. He continued to come, continued to stay, his presence unbroken. The girl grew bolder, riding his horse with giggles that echoed through the valley. The woman found herself smiling more often, though fear still lingered at the edges of her heart. She wondered when the moment would come when he, too, would turn away. But it never came. Instead, he built a small shelter near the river, offering her and the child safety from storm and cold. He asked nothing in return, only worked with steady hands, as if building a life was as natural as breathing. The woman's heart fought against its own longing. She told herself she must not trust too deeply, must not believe too fully, lest the ground crumble beneath her again. But one evening, as the sky burned crimson and the child slept, he laid his coat across her shoulders. The weight of it was more than warmth, It was belonging. She wept quietly, not from sorrow, but from the breaking of chains she had carried too long. Seasons shifted. The girl grew taller, her laughter freer. The whispers of the town did not cease, but they lost their power. The woman walked with her head higher now, her daughter's hand in one of hers, the cowboy's steady shadow beside them. She was no longer unseen. She was no longer forgotten. And then came the day beneath the wide, endless sky. There was no preacher, no church, only wind through the grass and the song of the river. The cowboy took her hand in his, rough palm steady against her trembling fingers. He spoke no grand vows, only words simple and true. "You're not alone anymore." That was enough. She felt her heart unfurl like a flower after long winter, felt her daughter's arms wrap around them both, sealing the bond as surely as any blessing. The years that followed were quiet, not without hardship, but rich with something deeper than she had ever dreamed. Together they built a home, not grand but strong, filled with laughter and the warmth of shared burdens. The river that once tempted despair became the river that nourished their fields, the river that sang them to sleep. Yet even in peace, the memory of that night lingered. The men who had threatened her were not seen again, but their words echoed sometimes in her mind, like distant thunder. On such nights, the cowboy would take her hand and hold it until the storm passed, reminding her with silence that her worth was not theirs to decide. The child, growing swiftly into her own strength, would sometimes ask if they were safe now, if the world could no longer hurt them. The woman would answer with honesty. The world was never gentle. But here, with him, with this new family they had woven, they were safe enough. And yet, one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the woman caught sight of a lone figure on the ridge, watching. A shiver traced her spine. She said nothing to the cowboy, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. But she knew the past had a way of finding its way back, knew that shadows lingered even in the brightest light. Her daughter's laughter rang out behind her, the cowboy's voice low and steady as he worked nearby, but her eyes lingered on the ridge where the figure had stood. The valley seemed quieter, the air heavier. She pulled her shawl tighter, heart steady but cautious, because deep inside she understood the story was not finished. And though love had given her strength, the world beyond still waited, ready to test what they had built.